Welcome back to another Explainer. Look, if you are gearing up for your CBSE Board Exams, you have absolutely landed in the perfect place. Today, we're unpacking Chapter 4, The Age of Industrialization. Think of this as a tale of two entirely different worlds. On one side, we've got Britain experiencing the sudden roaring explosion of factories and machines, and on the other side, we have India, undergoing a really complex, often painful transformation under colonial rule. We're going to visualize exactly how this era shaped both those massive mills and the millions of everyday workers. Okay, let's dive right into this.
Here's the roadmap for our explainer today. We're covering 6 key sections: proto-industrialization, factories and British workers, the decline of Indian textiles, the Gumasta system, India's early entrepreneurs, and finally, the peculiarities of Indian growth. Let's get into it.
Section 1. Proto-industrialization, the pre-factory era.
To really grasp this era, we have to look at the world before those massive, smoke-belching factories even existed. Now, the definition of proto-industrialization? It's a huge, frequent exam question. Basically, it was the early phase of industrialization, characterized by large-scale production for an international market. But, and hey, this is the absolute key phrase to remember. It was not based on factories. It was a completely decentralized system. You had merchants based in towns, sure, but the actual physical work, that was done by vast numbers of producers working right inside their family farms out in the countryside.
So why did rural peasants so readily agree to produce goods for these town merchants? Well, there are 3 crucial reasons you'll want to remember for your exams. First off, these peasants had tiny plots of land and had basically been shut out of the village commons because of the enclosure movement. Second, because of that, they desperately needed an alternative source of income. And third, taking cash advances from merchants allowed them to just remain in the countryside. They could keep cultivating their small plots while putting their entire family's labor to use. Honestly, it was a pretty brilliant survival strategy.
Moving on to Section 2, Factories and British Workers, the British Boom. When we look at how this builds into the sudden boom in British manufacturing, the pace of change was just incredibly rapid. The earliest factories in England were popping up by the 1730s. Then, a whole series of inventions just supercharged production. In 1764, James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, and by 1771, Richard Arkwright created the very first cotton mill. Suddenly, production was yanked out of those decentralized country cottages and brought together under one massive roof. This allowed for careful supervision and, of course, the strict regulation of labor.
And this invention brilliantly illustrates the massive disruption that followed. We're looking at the spinning jenny. Now, while industrialists absolutely loved it because, it sped up the spinning process and drastically reduced the demand for labor, it utterly terrified the workers. The fear of unemployment actually made workers super hostile to new technology. In the woolen industry, women who survived entirely on hand spinning violently attacked these new machines. They saw them as a literal, direct threat to their livelihood, and you can definitely see why.
Which brings us to the human cost. For the working class in Britain, this definitely wasn't an era of magic and wealth. It was a brutal struggle. The sheer abundance of labor, we're talking poor peasants flooding into the cities, meant wages stayed incredibly low. Plus, work in many industries was highly seasonal. So after a busy season, workers faced prolonged, scary periods of unemployment. Just to get by, many were forced to sleep under bridges or rely on night refuges and casual wards. It was tough.
Now here's a crucial point. While massive factories were rising everywhere, not everyone preferred machine-made items. In Victorian Britain, upper-class aristocrats and the bourgeoisie actually preferred handmade goods. Why? Well, because handmade items symbolized refinement and high class. They were carefully designed, just better finished overall. Industrialists, on the flip side, preferred machines to mass-produce cheap goods and just minimize their reliance on human labor.
All right, Section 3. Decline of Indian textiles, the colonial impact.
Let's cross the globe over to India. It is honestly incredible to realize that before the age of machine industries, India was the absolute, undisputed king of textiles. I mean, silk and fine coarser cottons from India completely dominated the international market. Indian merchants and bankers managed this massive, highly profitable export network.
But then, literally everything changed. The British took 3 very specific steps to crush the Indian textile market. First, under pressure from their own industrial groups, Britain imposed import duties on cotton textiles. This was just to protect their own Manchester goods from competition. Second, the East India Company flooded Indian markets with cheap British-manufactured goods, which obviously shrank local demand. Finally,
When the U.S. Civil War broke out, Britain's cotton supplies from America were cut off, so they turned to India, exporting raw cotton in bulk. This inflated prices tremendously, literally starving local Indian weavers of their raw materials.
Section 4. The Gomasta System. Ruthless Management.
To assert a complete monopoly over what was left of the trade, the East India Company introduced a ruthless new management system. So, who were the Gomastas? Listen, if you only remember one specific term from this chapter for your exams, make it this one. It's a hugely critical question.
The Gomastas were essentially paid servants appointed by the East India Company to supervise weavers, collect supplies, and examine cloth quality. Previously, local supply merchants actually lived in the villages and, helped weavers out during crises. But the Gomastas, they were arrogant outsiders with absolutely no social links to the village. They trapped weavers using a system of advances or loans. Once a weaver took that loan, they were locked in. They had to hand over their cloth only to the Gomasta and at remarkably low prices. And if there were delays, the Gomastas marched into villages with sepoys, physically punishing and even flogging the weavers. It was a really dark time.
Section 5. India's Early Entrepreneurs. Industrial Rebirth. Yet, despite this intense colonial control and exploitation, a remarkable Indian industrial rebirth began against all odds. Let's meet the pioneers who built massive industrial empires. Over in Bengal, Dwarkanath Tagore made his absolute fortune in the China trade before setting up 6 joint stock companies in the 1830s and 40s. Down in Bombay, Parsis like Dinshaw Petit and Jamsetji Tata accumulated massive wealth from exports to China and raw cotton shipments to England. And Seth Hukum Chand, a Marwari businessman, set up the very first Indian jute mill in Calcutta in 1917. What is so fascinating here is how many of these early empires were initially funded right through those trade networks with China.
But who was actually working in these new Indian mills? Listen to this quote from Vasant Parker, who was once a mill worker in Bombay. He said, "The mill worker was closely associated with his village, physically and emotionally. He would go home to cut the harvest." You see, even as factories grew in India, the workers maintained deep, deep roots in their rural villages, returning home during harvest seasons. It's a detail that really humanizes all this historical data.
Section 6. Peculiarities of Indian Growth. Indian Industries.
Industrialization in India didn't look exactly like it did in Britain. For a long, long time, Indian entrepreneurs were really boxed in. As colonial control tightened, Indian merchants were barred from trading manufactured goods with Europe. They were only allowed to export raw materials like cotton, opium, and wheat. Up until the First World War, European managing agencies like Bird Haglers & Co. completely monopolized and controlled the most profitable industrial sectors in India.
But here is a statistic that will completely change how you view this entire era. 5%. Just think about that. Despite the rise of massive mills and the fame of those early entrepreneurs we just talked about, only 5% of the total industrial labor force in India worked in registered factories in 1911.
That means a massive 95% of workers were not in factories. Small-scale production continued to absolutely predominate across the country. Large factory industries were actually just a tiny segment of the economy, concentrated almost entirely in Bengal and Bombay. The so-called Age of Industrialisation in India was for a very long time still very much an age of the small-scale artisan and craftsman.
Which leaves us with this pretty provocative thought to wrap up our explainer today. If the grand Age of Industrialization, an era literally defined in our history books by massive machines and imposing mills, was actually driven by millions of unseen, small-scale artisans adapting to change, well, what does that mean for the rapidly changing tech-driven industries of our future? The real power might just lie in the decentralized hands of the many, rather than the centralized factories of the few. Think about that as you study this chapter. Good luck with your exam prep and keep learning.